As we head into year 3 of this global pandemic, with the current death toll as of this recording at 5.57 million people worldwide, it's worth pausing to ask this question. How you doing? You doing okay? How you feeling? Have you lost any faith? I know I have lost faith. Prior to this pandemic, I understood that there was a significant portion of the population who fervently believed in bullshit, but I still had faith in humanity as a whole to band together in times of great trouble. That faith has been officially shaken, as I see many, many, many more people than even I expected behaving like selfish monsters when it comes to doing the bare minimum to protect the people around us. But I'm an atheist and a critical thinker, so faith was never really my forte anyway. So we turn to the Christians. How's their faith doing? According to a new study published this month in the Journal of Religion and Health, not so great. A team of psychologists surveyed nearly 5,000 Germans several times throughout the past 2 years to gauge their level of spirituality, trust in a higher power, frequency of prayer, trust in their local religious community, overall well-being, and their stress levels as related to COVID-19. And they found that as the pandemic wore on, more and more people started losing their faith. Not just on the loss of faith survey metric, but also in regards to how many people identified as Catholic, for instance, or how many people said that they were praying regularly. And trust in local religious communities went from indifferent at the start of the pandemic, the Germans being fairly secular compared to Americans, I suppose, to actually they kind of suck by the time the second wave hit. This result didn't happen just because older Germans who tend to be more religious were dying from COVID-19 and leaving a more atheistic younger population. The researchers controlled for age and a slew of other demographics. It also can't be explained by the fact that churches had to shut down during some waves. Yes, a person might naturally become less religious once they stop going to church and realize that, well, they don't really miss it. But this paper also found a drop in faith from people who weren't even affiliated with any church. The spiritual but not religious crowd who already weren't attending weekly services anywhere also experienced an equivalent drop in faith in a higher power. So, is this surprising? Many researchers do tend to think of religious faith as a crutch that people may lean on in times of trouble, when they might not have any other hope or when they don't fully understand what's happening to them. So with that in mind, you might expect people to become more religious during a pandemic, which some studies did suggest was happening in the early months of 2020 when this whole plague thing was still fresh and new. But religion isn't just one monstrosity, one monolith. And what many researchers, particularly historians, have noticed is that religiosity depends on a number of factors, including how any one religious institution responds to troubling times. Take the Black Death, for example. For 7 years, from 1346 to 1353, the plague killed 75 to 200 million people in Europe and the Near East. The two dominant religions at the time were Catholic Christianity in Europe and Islam in the Near East. And each one held enough power to more or less dictate how the general population responded to the plague. This was pre-germ theory, so at the time, pretty much everybody just figured that the plague was sent here by God, but they believed that for very different reasons. In general, Muslims thought of the plague as a hardship to be endured, like a flood or famine, but also kind of as a gift from God because the believers who died were ushered into a better world. Meanwhile, the Christians tended to think of the plague less as a gift and more as a punishment for sinners. This led to some conflicting thoughts in the good, godly people who were now watching their children and loved ones brutally succumb to a painful and inevitable death. Was their child evil? Would a just God really let that happen? On a side note, there was a strong belief amongst Christians that the plague was caused by Jews, who they already hated and regularly accused of murdering their children and poisoning their wells. So the plague naturally led to a sharp uptick in the murder of innocent Jewish people. But no amount of praying, repenting, murdering, or hitting yourself with a whip — yes, this is where the flagellants came from, not to be confused with flagellants — none of that made the plague stop. So while in the Near East, Muslims saw people dropping dead and thought, yep, that's Allah's will, so it goes, nothing to be done about it. In Europe, the Christians were throwing everything at the wall and nothing was sticking. Religious leaders told their adherents they could stop the plague by doing X, Y, and Z, but the plague just kept on going. The church's response to the plague helped inspire thinkers like John Wycliffe, not to be confused with thinkers like Wycliffe Jean. Wycliffe was a Christian priest who believed the church doctrine was right, that the plague was punishing evil sinners, but wrong about who those evil sinners were. He wrote a treatise saying it was, in fact, the clergy who were dying in particularly high numbers. So maybe he had a point. Wycliffe's thinking on the matter, along with other revolutionaries, led to Christianity effectively splitting at the seams, eventually resulting in the Protestant Reformation. Islam, meanwhile, just kind of shrugged and kept doing its thing for a few more centuries. It's undeniable that the plague caused a significant drop in Christian faith, or at the very least, a redistribution of faith away from established religious institutions. As Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett wrote in a report for the Council on Foreign Relations, because the church could neither explain the plague nor stop it, its power eroded in the eyes of average Europeans, many of whom turned to mysticism, superstition, or blends of ancient paganism and Catholicism to fill their spiritual needs. People didn't just blindly find comfort in the religion of their parents and grandparents. This great tragedy shook them up and made them reconsider what they truly believed about God and about the religious institutions that they had thus far blindly followed. So it's not shocking that a study would find a similar result today, though the conditions are quite different. During the Black Death, religion stood alone as the way for people to understand and thus deal with what was happening to them. By the time the 1919 influenza rolled around, which killed 50 to 100 million people, doctors kind of understood germ theory and were able to offer an alternate explanation. While they might not have known exactly what was happening, they did know enough to offer good advice on stopping the spread, which meant asking people to wear masks and shutting down public gatherings, including church services. Sound familiar? Some clergy members agreed with the science, while others flagrantly kept their doors open because the problem was clearly an angry God who could only be sated with public prayer, and also because people needed detachment from the present distress, comfort and inspiration for further duty, and the need of breathing another atmosphere, if only for a brief space. The result was that a huge number of deaths occurred specifically because of religious services, like in the Spanish city of Zamora, where church services not only continued, but were amped up considerably, leading the city to become the hardest hit in the country. I can't tell you if the 1919 influenza led to a loss of faith, as it coincided with the end of a world war and the beginning of a recession that would lead to the Great Depression. There were a lot of different factors mixed up in all of this. But I do suspect that the sudden clash of science and religion during the influenza outbreak did lead in part to the rise of Christian fundamentalism in the United States, as many church leaders became committed to putting science and what they considered to be government overreach in the name of science back in its place. For instance, the Scopes monkey trial just came a few years later, paving the way for a very long battle between science and religion. I think that in this latest pandemic, we're seeing some of the same things we've seen before. Some theists feel their religion is in competition with science and with public health measures, leading them to attend services, discredit scientists, and inevitably get sick and die. Other theists see this happening, and they maybe take a moment to reconsider who they've been following and what they've been believing all these years and asking themselves, is this true? Like, I know several people who claim to be Christians, went to church throughout the beginning of the pandemic, despite all warnings. And, I, as an atheist, was like, Jesus would hate you. You are purposely putting people at risk. And these were Christians who didn't deny that COVID was a real thing and a real danger to others, but they were young and healthy and knew that the risk to themselves was small. And so they went about their lives. While Christ was supposed to be all about caring for the people who were most at risk. So I know that if I had still been a Christian when all this was going down, I would have a hard time figuring out how my religion was the same as the people that I had been going to church with. I don't think that this pandemic is going to somehow destroy religious faith. Unfortunately, I think that superstitious beliefs are just a part of being human, and therefore so is religion. At least for now and for the next few centuries. But I do hope that more people are critically examining the claims made by the leaders of their religious institutions. Are they acting in your best interests or in the best interests of your community? Or are they acting in their own best interests? Are they still in the Middle Ages, whipping themselves and killing innocent people because they think a Jewish wizard is poisoning them?